Welcome back to The Download. I'm Reid Mercer, and okay, get this. James Murdoch is reportedly making a move on Vox Media's podcast unit and New York Magazine. Lupa Systems, around $300 million on the table. Multiple outlets confirmed it this week. Deadline, Reuters, The Post. We're going to break down what this deal says about how serious buyers are actually valuing podcast assets right now. Then we've got Futurism reporting that nearly half of new podcasts show signs of AI generation. Half! And Spotify just opened a direct publishing pipeline for AI agents. So if you were wondering when the catalog quality problem becomes an ad CPM problem, we're getting close to that answer. iHeart dropped Q1 numbers today. Digital and podcast revenue up nearly 10%. Sounds great, but Magellan AI put out research this week saying podcast advertisers are essentially buying blind in 2026. Promo codes missing conversions, genre signals misleading buyers. The margin story gets complicated fast. And the Reuters Institute dropped a study on video podcasts. The video-first narrative is getting a serious stress test. Audio is still dominant for news consumption. The question is whether the pivot to video is a real distribution bet or just spend chasing platform incentives. A lot to cover. Let's get into it, starting with that Murdoch deal. We want to hear from you. Submit questions via the web form in the description or give us a call at 747-234-2678 and leave your question. Don't be shy, our AI assistant makes it super easy. Okay, so get this. $300 million. That's the reported offer James Murdoch's Lupa Systems put on the table for New York Magazine and Vox Media's podcast unit. Crane's New York business had the figure this week, and Deadline confirmed Lupa is in advanced talks. For anyone keeping score at home, a Murdoch is circling prestige independent media. Let that land for a second. Now, the irony writes itself. The family that built an empire on tabloids and cable news is now making a serious run at what might be the most credentialed podcast portfolio outside of Spotify's own stable. But set the irony aside, because the strategic logic here is actually sharp. Here's what the deal structure tells you. According to Podcast News Daily and the New York Post's reporting, this isn't a bid for all of Vox Media. Lupa wants New York Magazine and the podcast unit specifically. Over 36 shows. That separation is the signal. Buyers right now are not paying for digital media traffic or banner ad inventory. They're paying for audio brand equity and engaged audiences. That's a meaningful shift from even 18 months ago. I lived through the 2019 acquisition cycle on the operating side, and the pattern then was scale-driven. Buy the network, harvest the ad inventory, cut the costs. What Murdoch appears to be doing here is different. This looks more like a cable bundling play, the kind where you acquire flagship brands that pull subscribers and then build a portfolio around them. New York Magazine has the institutional credibility. The podcast unit has the distribution habits. Put those together and you have something a pure-play audio network can't easily replicate. Now, stress test the number. $300 million for a podcast unit that, per the reporting, includes more than 36 shows. That's not a distressed asset price. If anything, it says Murdoch's team looked at this and decided independent podcast networks are undervalued, not broken. And Crane's noted the assets could ultimately sell for more. Someone else was in that room. Reuters confirmed the WSJ had the original report. Deadline had it confirmed by Tuesday. When three newsrooms are stacking up on the same story in 48 hours, the deal is either close or the sellers are running a very deliberate process. Given what I've been hearing from people adjacent to the independent network space, I'd lean toward the latter. So what does this mean for the broader M&A environment? A few things. One, serious capital is still circling podcast assets despite the macro noise around ad spend. Two, the valuation logic has shifted to brand and audience depth away from raw download numbers. And three, when a buyer of this profile moves, it tends to pull other capital off the sidelines. Vox built something real. Lupa is betting it's worth more in focused hands than inside a broader digital media holding company trying to be everything. But here's the question I keep coming back to. If the premium in this deal is for quality, for brand, for trust with an audience, What happens to that valuation logic when the supply side of podcasting is flooding the market with something that looks like audio content but isn't built on any of those things? So that quality premium we just put a price tag on, here's what's quietly eating at it. Futurism reported this week that approaching half of new podcasts show signs of being AI-generated. Not a few, not a fringe problem, nearly half. Let that land for a second. Now, some of that is benign. Automated sports roundups, weather briefings, niche hobbyist content that nobody was going to produce anyway. Fine. But some of it is something else entirely. The Conversation published a breakdown of a show called The Epstein Files. AI-generated audio, coherent sounding, mimics investigative journalism, sourced nothing, accountable to no one. The piece made the point directly. Coherence is not the same as sense-making. Pattern recognition is not interpretation. That distinction matters enormously to anyone who advertises on a show they think is journalism. And here's where Spotify's timing gets interesting. MacRumors and EngGad both covered the launch this week. Spotify now lets AI agents, specifically something called OpenClaw, publish personal AI-generated audio briefings directly into a user's library. The Verge called the tool a command line interface that saves audio alongside your other podcasts. So, on one hand, you've got a report saying the catalog is already drowning in AI volume. On the other, the largest podcast platform on Earth just opened a direct pipeline for AI agents to push content straight in. Those two things are happening simultaneously. I want to be careful here. Spotify's framing is personalized briefings, not mass publishing. There's a use case distinction between an AI summarizing your newsfeed and a bot farm churning out thousands of fake interview shows. But the infrastructure doesn't know the difference, and once the tooling exists, the abuse cases follow. We've seen this movie. We literally covered the synthetic voice backlash in April. The technology gets built for good reasons, and then someone figures out the arbitrage. The catalog integrity problem is real, and it's accelerating. And here's why it's not just a content quality story. It's an advertiser confidence story.
If you're a brand buying podcast inventory at scale, you're trusting that the shows you're running on represent actual audience relationships, authentic, consistent, built over time. That's the whole pitch for why podcast CPMs command a premium over display. The host-read ad, the trust transfer, the engaged listener. When approaching half of new supply is machine-generated content of unknown provenance, that pitch starts to wobble, not collapse, wobble. The established shows with real audiences still hold their value, but the long tail, that's where the math gets ugly. And that wobble connects directly to something Magellan AI put out this week, a finding that should make every podcast sales team uncomfortable. Advertisers in 2026 are essentially buying blind. Bad data, flawed assumptions, measurement gaps that have been papered over for years. That's the structural problem sitting underneath every optimistic revenue headline. And iHeart's Q1 numbers, which are genuinely strong on the surface, are worth stress testing against exactly that backdrop.
So let me give you the number first, then ruin it for you. iHeart's Q1 just dropped. Digital and podcast revenue up nearly 10%. WSJ covered it, Billboard covered it. Everyone's running the headline. And honestly, for a company carrying that much legacy radio weight, 10% digital growth is not nothing. But here's where my 2 years on the buy side kicks in. Top-line growth that flatters a margin story is one of the oldest tricks in the media pitch deck. iHeart's overall ad market stayed soft. Profits got squeezed. So what you're actually looking at is a business where the bright segment is pulling hard against a heavier anchor. That's not a turnaround. That's a tug of war. And now for the part that should bother every sales team in this industry. In emphasis, Magellan AI, working with True Native Media, put out a guide this week that Radio Inc. flagged. The headline finding, podcast advertisers are effectively buying blind in 2026. promo codes miss conversions, genre signals mislead, and audience overlap across shows is far lower than most media plans assume, which means buyers are building schedules on assumptions that the data does not support. Incredulous. Promo codes in 2026, that's still a primary attribution tool for a medium that's supposed to be the sophisticated alternative to broadcast. Podcast News Daily added more color on this. The Magellan report says audio buying hasn't kept pace with how the medium has actually evolved. Podcasts extend reach beyond streaming in ways that standard planning frameworks don't capture. And improved attribution tools exist, they're just not being used at scale. So the gap between what the medium can prove and what buyers are actually measuring is growing, not shrinking. Now connect that back to iHeart's number. Near 10% digital revenue growth sounds strong, but if the underlying measurement infrastructure is this leaky, how confident are you in the CPMs holding? Because advertisers who feel like they're buying blind eventually either demand a discount or leave for a channel where the attribution story is cleaner.
Inside Radio reported that April ad spending reset to a more typical pace, with the top 10 podcast advertisers totaling $29 million. Shopify moved into the number 1 spot at $4.9 million. That's a reset, not a collapse. But resets after a strong quarter tend to reveal which revenue was structural and which was timing. The industry keeps posting optimistic headlines while the plumbing underneath stays broken. That's fine until a buyer gets burned badly enough to start asking hard questions in a renewal meeting. Now, flip that on its head. If the measurement problem is the ceiling on monetization, then format strategy becomes the floor you can actually build on. And that's a more interesting conversation because the Reuters Institute just released data that complicates every assumption about where video fits into that picture.
So format strategy becomes the lever you can actually pull, and the Reuters Institute just made that decision a lot harder. Here's what their study found via Podcast News Daily. For news podcasts specifically, audio still dominates actual consumption behavior. Most listeners are not abandoning their ears for a screen. Publishers are pivoting to video anyway. Which tells you something. The video push isn't purely audience-driven. It's about monetization surface area. Video opens YouTube pre-rolls, sponsorship overlays, clip distribution. Personality-led formats command higher CPMs. Executives are chasing revenue geometry, not necessarily where the audience actually is. Reuters Institute found the audience data doesn't match the strategy decks. Coherence is not the same as actual demand. So here's the question network executives should be sitting with right now. Is your video investment a distribution bet with a real return path, or a production cost you can't unwind once the ad market softens again? Because if attribution is broken and AI is flooding the catalog, format shifts don't solve the underlying problem. They just move it to a more expensive studio.
All right, that's a wrap on today's download. 3 threads worth sitting with. Murdoch putting real money behind audio brand equity, nearly half of new podcasts showing AI generation signals, and iHeart posting near 10% digital growth while the measurement gap quietly widens underneath it. The through line, quality premium in audio is both more valuable and more fragile than most people in this industry want to admit. Thoughtfully, the Epstein Files moment summed it up cleanly. Coherence is not sense-making, worth writing on a whiteboard somewhere. If today's episode connected some dots for you, forward it to a colleague who needs to hear it. Tips, feedback, story leads, the download at heymatto.com. Thanks for being here. Stay sharp, stay skeptical, and we'll see you next time.